Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Backlog Bunker. This week, good news, we're only talking about two games, Yakuza 6 and Marvel Rivals. Bad news, I really hated Yakuza 6, which disappoints me for a lot of reasons, but mostly because I had hopes for Yakuza 6 being in the Dragon Engine, because that's kind of what I liked about Kiwami 2, is that it wasn't like the other Yakuza games, it played better than them, and so I trudged through 3 and 4 and 5, though trudge through is a bit of an overstatement for 3 and 5 because I skipped those. But still, I spent a lot of time just waiting to get back to the Dragon Engine so I could have fun playing Yakuza games again, at least the action-focused Yakuza games. The RPGs will be a different story. But unfortunately, like I said, Yakuza 6 was a game that I hated playing. It's not worse than other Yakuza games, because in terms of like the pure numbers, 0 and 4, I think I have it a 4 out of 10, and then Kiwami 1 is at a 5. And then 3 and 5, I didn't really play, so I didn't really score. 5 I did because I played more of that than 3, but even then, it got a 4 because it was a lot like Yakuza's 4 and 0. But I can't say definitively that it is a 4. The point being, Kiwami 2 is the highest Yakuza game I've rated with the 7, and 6 is certainly not as good as Kiwami 2. Though I've wondered if that's just a pure perspective thing, because I played Kiwami 2 after having come out of 0 and Kiwami 1, which were games that I did not like, and so Kiwami 2 being any bit better than them might have colored my perception of that game way more than it should have. Because in playing Yakuza 6, it feels a lot like how it felt to play Kiwami 2, but the game is so bad that I'm wondering if I just remember Kiwami 2 wrong. The first and most obvious issue to me when I started playing 6 was that the combat was just not good. Because much like Yakuza 3, Yakuza 6 very much has a lot of enemies that just block all the time in the middle of combos before you even start combos and you try to use finishing moves. You cannot finish any combo on an enemy without them blocking or dodging out of the way in the middle of it. And the combos themselves feel just way more sluggish than every other Yakuza game, which I almost want to say is on purpose, because there are upgrades in the upgrade menu that are like, oh yeah, boost combo speed, but boosting combo speed just feels like my normal combo speed after it was boosted. And we'll get to the upgrade screen later, but for now, just sticking with combat. Even like getting behind enemies, which is like the tried and true method of getting guaranteed damage in through these games, is just not consistent, because there are many times where I will get behind an enemy and attack them, and then the auto turnaround is so generous in their favor that like 1 or 2 hits in, they're already back to facing me. This was very noticeable when using Extreme Heat Mode, which again, to bring up Kiwami 2, it did not feel like this in that game, or I'm just remembering it wrong, but in 6, whenever you use Extreme Heat Mode on a boss, trying to finish any combo and use the Extreme Heat actions, it's just not going to work. Because if you try to use the finishing blow extreme heat actions, then they'll just dodge out the way, and if you try to use the rush combo heat action, they'll just start blocking, or also dodge out of the way. Or they'll hit you so hard you just stop using the combo in general, and you won't even be able to finish it, even though you're supposed to have super armor. But it sucks because extreme heat mode's like one of the 2 things you can even use your heat bars on, because the actual heat moves in this game are very few and far between. I didn't like 0 and Kiwami 1 all that much, but I remember getting to use heat moves fairly often, mostly because of things like finishing blow, but also because the situations in which you get to use heat moves are common situations you'll run into, like rush mode when you're up against the wall and you make someone punch the wall instead of you. That's decently common in any given area, but in Kiwami 2 and in Yakuza 6, it feels like there are far less heat moves than in any other game in the series, because the heat moves that you actually get to use are things that are either hyper-specific, like having an enemy in a corner, which A, you can only do inside, and B, assumes that you even get them close enough to the corner without them getting out the way, or they require you to have grabbed the enemy first, which, to be fair, in Yakuza 6, I've noticed that there's a higher chance of grabs actually working than any other Yakuza game, but they still don't work all the time, especially not on bosses. So having, like, 50% of the heat moves come from getting grabs first is annoying at the very least. If I had the time, care, or energy, or if someone asked me to, then I would absolutely pull up a list of 0's heat moves compared to 6's heat moves, and I guarantee you that 0 would have way more situations where you can actually use them. But if heat moves are rare, then what was the other thing I was talking about earlier with the 2 things you can use your heat bars on? And it's still technically heat moves, just not the traditional sense. Because as I got farther and farther along into the game, I noticed that there was one heat move that I could always consistently pull off that would even work on bosses, and that's furniture breaking. As long as you have enough time to grab it and line yourself up with the boss without getting smacked in the back, then you have enough time to just unleash a heat move on them for essentially free damage. And since this was basically the only kind of consistency I could even get with the combat, furniture heat moves became the vast majority of my gameplay in the later parts of the game. I'm not sure exactly what footage I'll end up using for this, because I recorded basically all of my Yakuza 6 gameplay, but that's like 3-hour chunks that I don't want to have to comb through, so hopefully I find it, but if I don't, you know, it's not the end of the world. But just to put things into perspective, when I was doing the Somaya boss fight, there's like an entire table full of bars, or not a table, counter full of like bar stools for you to use. I would always just walk away, lead him away from them, pick one up, walk my ass back over there, and then heat move him, and that's the entire fight. I don't think I ever hit him normally once. Even outside of bosses, furniture actually is just one of the best ways to play the game, even with extreme heat mode, because extreme heat mode is basically beast mode from Yakuza 0, where you'll automatically pick up anything in the vicinity and just start throwing that shit around. And that ended up working way better for the group fights in this game, because much like every other Yakuza game that I've played, group fights are still awful. Again, since getting hit from the back is a guaranteed hit, any group fight is just rigged against the player because you're going to get hit in the back. You cannot hit every enemy at the same time, and especially not on both sides of you. Which is why furniture is so useful, because it has such a big swing arc that you'll be able to hit most enemies at the same time. Not all, mind you, there will still be times where you get hit in the back and end up dropping your furniture and it instantly breaks and you have to go find a new one, but for the most part, it does work pretty well. Which is damn well better, since there's really no crowd control in Yakuza games. The best that this game has is the grabbing an enemy and then swinging them around, but that does like actual piss damage. The best it'll do is get a few enemies off your back for a second, and then you'll be right back to where you started. But that's enough about the combat, because now I want to talk about something that's adjacent to the combat, which is the EXP system, and how it's really, really bad. Basically, Yakuza 6 works on this division of EXP system, where there's different kinds of EXP, and then when you actually go to buy upgrades, they just take different kinds of EXP. So like, upgrading your attack will only take red EXP, but upgrading health will take red and orange EXP. And initially this sounds fine, but the more you get into it, the more you realize that it's kind of pointless and also really bad. Pointless in that when you go to buy upgrades, a lot of them, or at least a lot of the important ones, will actually take multiple kinds of EXP anyway, if not all of them. So what's the point of dividing the EXP if at the end of the day a lot of the most important upgrades are going to cost all of them anyway? Then you realize things like how the division of EXP just isn't balanced at all. You get way less green and purple EXP than you do red, blue, and orange. So the further and further you get into the game, the more you realize that you have an overabundance of one kind of EXP, but actual pennies in the others, which isn't helped by the fact that your stats will take multiple kinds of EXP, but not ever a single kind of EXP, aside from attack. Because again, attack will take red EXP, but health takes red and orange, which really isn't that much of a bad thing, because you get a lot of red and orange EXP, and then agility only takes blue. But defense takes orange and green's kinda rare, and the heat mode takes green and purple, both of which are rare. So you end up with this wild disparity where you end up with a vast majority of red and orange EXP and then quite a bit of blue, but then you're always scrounging for whatever greens and purples you can find. And I know that I started this part with pointless, but we're already dipping into the bad territory, but it gets really bad when you think about why the other kinds of EXP are rare. And that's because of the weaker part, which is that you don't get a lot from combat, and the far more egregious part, which is that you don't get a lot from sub-stories. I shit on Kiwami 1 a lot because I just didn't really like that game, but that's because the vast majority of that game was the combat. The story was fine, every other thing in that game was fine, but it's a combat game. If I don't like the combat, I'm not going to like the game. But in terms of everything else in the game, like the EXP system for example, it was fine, if not actually good, because the way it worked there was that it was one universal EXP, as most games operate. So if you did a sub-story, or beat a boss, or whatever was the case, then you would just get EXP, and you would get levels and you would spend that on upgrades, obviously. So anytime you did one of these things, it actually paid off, and you felt like it paid off because you could tangibly see the XP you were getting and it was just a linear number. But since there are different kinds of EXP in Yakuza 6, and for some ungodly reason, sub-stories and bosses and all that don't give you the same amount of EXP across the board, you end up with a lot of situations where you'll get like hundreds of red EXP for doing something, and maybe double digits in the greens or purples. So 6 ended up being really the only Yakuza game where I actively skipped sub-stories, or the stories of the sub-stories, because it waned very, very thin on my patience watching a cutscene that I even might have been kind of interested in, knowing that at the end of it I wasn't going to get shit for it. And speaking of my patience wearing thin, we get to what's the real problem with Yakuza 6, or at least the real problem for me, which is that Yakuza 6 does not respect my time in the slightest. And to make a long story short, not respecting my time is like the most consistent way to make me angry in a video game. Because there are many things I don't like in games, there are many things I think are bad in games. I've made entire videos about things that I think are bad in games. However, the only time I ever get angry at a game is when I waste my time, because I value my time, as most people do. And it's easy to look at things in retrospect and see that your time was wasted, but you couldn't have known that at the time, so what you gonna do about it now? Like, do I look back on Yakuza 0 and think that I wasted my time? Yeah, sure. But while I was playing Yakuza 0, I didn't feel that way, so I can't complain about it now just because I think in retrospect I wasted my time. However, this conversely means that when I can tell my time is being wasted while I'm doing the thing, it will only ever irritate me. And Yakuza 0 is the only Yakuza game to have gotten away with this, because at the time I was playing it, I was in very much of a honeymoon phase where I was just taking in the Yakuza, and I wasn't really aware of how bad the games were yet. But every other Yakuza game after that has consistently showed me points where I feel my time being wasted, and that's the shit that I don't like. That's what gets on my nerves, and it happened to me at a breaking point with 6. Which I'm sure people who've played 6 will be able to guess ahead of time, but it happens early on in the game, where you have to take care of Haruto, and there's a point where you have to get him some milk, and you're walking back and forth throughout town to find a place where you get Haruto some milk, and you're constantly just talking to people, and they're going, sorry, no milk here, sorry, no milk here, sorry, no milk here, and that's the entire gameplay. You just walk back and forth talking to people, and they all say, nope, sorry, fuck you, and in between all of those parts, you have to play a Rock the Baby minigame. Why? Because they felt like putting it in. And I try not to let my emotions impact my critical analysis of a game, because those two are very different things. However, I will accept that there's a possibility that my emotions got in the way of my critical analysis of 6. Not that I think I'm wrong, by the way. Don't get it twisted. I still think I'm right about Yakuza 6. I'm just saying that there's a possibility that I might be wrong, because my perception of the game was very, very much colored by that early instance of my time being wasted, because I was never, ever, ever in a good mood after that. Even the story, which I think is fine. Yakuza 6 has a fine story, if it does take a few too many things from 3. I still think it was an okay story, but I was never having a good time watching it, except for maybe near the end of some of the Yuta things, because he's like, I'm a dad, that's crazy. But for the most part, I just wasn't having a good time going through the story, because the entire time I was just thinking of, God, where is my time going? Which is not helped by the fact that Yakuza 6 is a very long story. It's like 13 hours of cutscenes in a game that people say is like 18 hours long. But I just kept having that feeling of my time being wasted over and over and over again. The Haruto situation was the worst one, but it just kept happening. Like walking around Kamurocho, there are a lot of parts of the streets that are just blocked off, making you take longer to get places. Why are they blocked off? No reason. It wasn't to gate you from, like, story progression or anything. They're just there. For some reason. And now, some people might argue that it's realistic. Yeah, a city would just be under construction sometimes, especially since a lot of it just burned down recently. But, fuck you, actually. I don't care about realism, and I don't think they care about realism either. This is the same series where, not but a game later, at least in Kiwami time, Kiryu punches a tiger out. And a game earlier in Yakuza time, well, 2 games earlier, because 0 just came out, but 2 games earlier in real life time, Saejima fought a bear with his bare hands. Not his bare hands, but his bare hands. And not even a normal bear either, it's an abnormally large bear. So I don't want to hear any realism arguments. Why did they block off parts of the city just to stop you from walking through it? Just to make you take longer? Then there's things like when you're going through Shangri-La, and there are parts where you have to, like, grab a hammer to knock down a wall, but why did you put the wall there in the first place? There's an infinite amount of hammers, the hammers are right next to the breakable wall, why even put the breakable wall there if it's effectively the same as just walking through it? When I see things like this, it really boggles the mind, because I'm no expert, I've only made one video game before, and it's not a very good video game, and it's not even a full video game. So I am not an expert on how to make a video game, but when I see these things in video games, I can only ever wonder why. Whose idea was it to put the things in the game that only serve to waste your time? What did people playtest the hammer breaking part and think it was fun? Did they have to stop, break down the wall, and go, oh my god, I'm having the time of my life right now? Redundancies are awful in video games, and I cannot think of a single time there's ever been a redundant thing in the game that has ever been good, or at the very least passable. Which is why, ultimately, I say the Yakuza 6 does not respect my time. Because if Yakuza 6 respected my time, they would get rid of the redundancies, they would get rid of the blocked off sections, and they would get rid of the stupid fucking baby rocking minigame that no one likes. And I mean no one, because if there is someone out there who's like, but I like the baby rocking minigame, no, you're not a person, you're not a real person, because I don't believe you if you said that to me. I would assume you're either a robot, or you're just lying. I said it before, I'm not sure on this series, but I've definitely said it to people before, that I would love to talk to someone who likes these games that I hate, and stand over their shoulder and ask them when the fun part is, or if they're having fun, ask them why, because it boggles the mind, these things. I'm glad to be done with Yakuza 6 at this point, but I'm going to be starting Yakuza 7 soon, and it's a very different game, which means that it doesn't have the opportunity to make the same failings as the previous ones, but it also has the opportunity to just be a bad RPG. So if those games are bad, all of which I own, by the way, because I bought the entire series, I regret that now, but like I said, retrospect. And so, if those games are also bad, I will cry real tears, because Yakuza 7 is the entire reason I even played these games. But I knew they had a continuous story, and so I figured it was just best to play all of them, especially since I already owned 0, and so I figured I'll just buy all the ones in between 0 and 7, and I'll play the whole series. It'll be fine, and it wasn't fine. So like I said, if 7 also sucks, I will cry, and then I'll have to play 8 anyway because I also own that, and then I'll cry again. But then maybe I'll get to move on to a series that I actually will enjoy, but Final Fantasy's also still there, so no guarantees. But now on to the weekly topic for this episode, which is about Marvel Rivals, specifically about its nature as a hero shooter and whether or not it needs a role queue. And I'm of the opinion that it does, because I am thoroughly unconvinced by the arguments people present for role queue being a bad thing. Because the best argument that I've ever heard for it is that it makes the queue times too long. But at the same time, if the queue times are long because of the ecosystem of the game, then that's just like a problem with the game. Like, I imagine if Marvel Rivals had a role queue, it would probably be very, very long for DPS and then way shorter for Vanguard and Healer, but that's because Marvel Rivals has like 7 tanks and healers and then like 20 DPS characters. So if there's a large disparity between the queue times between certain roles, that just means the game has to be designed better for certain roles to be more fun. If no one wants to play your healers, it's because your healers aren't fun, so make your healers more fun. And now granted, this is also because a lot of people come into these hero shooters and want to play them like other shooters and just want to go in and shoot people. Which is why I say that the queue time argument is the best one I've ever heard, because at the end of the day, it is the most convincing, though not very convincing still. But I feel as if the natural progression of the game is that more people will settle into whatever roles they want, and so as the game gets further and further and the player base gets smaller and smaller and more refined, there will be the people who play the healers, there will be the people who play the tanks, and there will be the people who play the DPS. And while the majority of people will still be in DPS, there will be far fewer of them that are role hogging just to bottom frag. And with role queue, it won't be as bad if someone's bottom fragging, because the other DPS will hopefully be one that can actually play the game. Because the way it works now is that, let's say you get into a game with 3 DPS characters, and let's just say, hypothetically, it's a game that I played where one of the DPSs was a Moon Knight, and then there were 3 of us. And there's me, there's Moon Knight, and there's the other DPS who I think was a Psylocke, hypothetically. And as we're playing this game, we lose the first round, and I notice, looking over at the scoreboard, that our Moon Knight has 1 kill and like 5 deaths. And so, when one of my teammates, again, hypothetically, types into chat, "Yo, we need another tank," the first thing that I suggest, hypothetically, is that the Moon Knight should switch off because he's not doing shit right now. But the Moon Knight, in all of his infinite wisdom, decided not to switch off. And so what we ended up with instead is our Psylocke switching off of damage and going to tank because she had no other choice. It was either I switch, but I had the highest kills, or Moon Knight switch, which he wasn't going to do. And we ended up losing the game in total because, again, our Moon Knight was awful. And to this, some people would argue, well, role queue doesn't fix the situation, because all role queue is going to do is make it so that it's Moon Knight and 1 other damage, and then that's it. But that's not true, because again, the Psylocke was a damage that had to switch to being a tank, and imagine, if you will, the Psylocke is not as good at playing tank as they are at playing damage, and so we end up losing the game because our only other tank was not very experienced or very good at playing tank, whereas in a situation with role queue, we would preferably be having someone queue up for a tank that knows how to play tank. And to this, some people will say, well, everyone should be multi-skilled. It's fine to have a preferred role, but you should be able to play all 3. And while I fundamentally disagree with this from a fighting game perspective, let's entertain that argument for a second. Should people be multi-skilled? Yes, you should be able to play multiple classes, which I can do. I mostly prefer DPS, but I can play tank and healer. The problem is that I'm not as good at tank or healer. The characters that are in tank and healer are not ones that I like as much as Iron Man. Not helped by the fact that the tank that I chose to play specifically was Captain America. I tried all the other ones, and Captain America was the only one that I liked, and the only one that I'm really good at. And while I certainly see success with Captain America, if I'm the only tank on the team and I'm playing Captain America, I'm selling the game. It's one thing to be able to play other classes, it's another thing to be good at those other classes, or to be the best at those other classes. And if DPS is my best role, what business do I have switching off of it just because someone else is too stubborn to switch off? And if someone were at that point to argue, well, you should be the best at all 3 roles, and every character in those roles, then I would argue that's a ludicrous argument. Because, again, to bring some back to fighting games, would you say that for a fighting game? Ever? Not just to be able to play all of them, but to be the best at all of them, to be equally good at every character in every role in the game. That's ludicrous. And I would assume that anyone who argues that unironically is just acting in bad faith, because, come on. Another argument that I've seen against role queue is that it's just less fun, that there's less flexibility in what you can do in the middle of a game, and so it's just less fun to actually act out, which I disagree with because I don't find switching to a completely different role in the middle of a game fun. I would like to stick to the same one, if you please. But again, let's just entertain this argument for a second and see where it goes. So if open queue is more fun, then why not just have a different mode for open queue? I understand that right now the game has just come out, and so there's no like definitive role structure. Like, I've heard people argue that 1, 2, 3 is pretty good, as in 1 tank, 2 healers, 3 damage, and I can see that for some tanks, like Penny or Venom, but for characters like Captain America, that's just not gonna work. If at some point in the game's future, where the ecosystem balances out, where characters are stronger or weaker in certain situations, and the 1, 2, 3 meta is actually possible, or even an open queue meta is just entirely flexible enough to be possible, then I am very much willing to take back my words here, but as the game exists right now, 2-2-2 is just the most consistently workable meta. I know this is anecdotal, but in my experience, having played these games, the only time where I'm asking where are my healers are either when we do have 2 healers but they're just not doing their job, which does happen because people are just bad at the game sometimes, or when we only have the 1 healer and they're dead because we don't have any other healer to heal them, and they got picked off and now no one's getting healed. So open queue being more fun, I can see it, but I don't agree with it. And then there's another argument that I've heard, which is the stupidest one so far, which is that role queue lowers the skill floor. And if you're not familiar with the concept of a skill floor and a skill ceiling, essentially, the way it works is that the skill floor is the entry point for people. How easy is it to get into the game? If a game has a low skill floor, that means it's very, very easy to get into. If it has a high skill floor, that means it's very, very hard to get into. And then opposite of that is the skill ceiling, which is what is the absolute peak of complexity the game reaches. So a low skill ceiling means that you can't really get much better than how you started the game. And a high skill ceiling means there's a lot of room for growth for you to be able to grow your skill. And we're at the point right now, both in gaming and in real life, that anyone with a brain will agree that a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling is optimal. You want to let anybody be able to pick up the game if they so choose, but you also want to let those people be able to continue to grow in the game. So when I see someone on twitter.com go, role queue lowers the skill floor, I say, well, yeah, that's a good thing. The only time lowering the skill floor is a bad thing is when it also lowers the skill ceiling, which some games do fall victim to. But again, that's not what this person said. This person only said that it lowered the skill floor. Honestly, there's not even much for me to really argue against here. Like I said, the optimal situation for a game is a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling. So when someone says it's a bad thing that there's a low skill floor, what do I say to that other than, that's stupid? You're stupid. Stop saying the stupid things you're saying. And then this same person was also arguing in the comments about being like, well, if you don't want to get matched up with people who are, like, selling in their roles, then just rank up, dude. Which is correct. If you want to play with better people, then play in better ranks. That checks out. The problem is that Marvel Rivals, if you didn't know, is a hero shooter, and hero shooters have this nasty little problem where they are very dependent on your entire team to win a game, and if you don't win a game, you don't rank up. So, if the problem that I'm currently facing is that I'm losing games because my teammates are awful, the solution to that is not to win games, because that in and of itself is the problem. That is why I'm being stopped from doing. Even if I'm playing DPS and I switch to tank or healer, if I'm clocking in overtime, and everyone else is showing up late to work, I cannot win. It's just not gonna happen. It doesn't matter how well I do, even if I go to those roles, because, again, unless my team is also helping me win, I'm not going to rank up. We're just gonna lose at the end of the day, and I'm back to where I started. And this deeply annoys me, because I don't play Splatoon 3 very often anymore, but god do I wish that I did, because Splatoon 3 genuinely perfected team-based ranking up, and no game has sought to replicate it since, and I don't know why. For those who don't know, Splatoon 3's ranking up system is a meritocracy, which means that the way you rank up is based on your accomplishments in a match. If you have the most kills, if you have the most turf inked, if you have the most time in the objective, if you have the most assists, things like that. And so even if you lose a game, if you have gold medals across the board, you will rank up. It'll take longer if you don't win, but you won't ever lose anything, and that's the important part. And Splatoon is less of a team-based shooter than hero shooters, because in Splatoon, it does matter that your team supports you, but you can very much just carry if you are really good at the game. In some game modes, not quite all of them. But in hero shooters, the entire thing revolves around your team supporting each other. That's why there's even roles to begin with. So the fact that hero shooters don't have this meritocracy, even though there are very much systems in place for having this, be a thing that supports you, there's just nothing. If you lose a game, you rank down. If you win a game, you rank up. And it's all a bunch of horse shit. I might have mentioned it last week when I talked about Marvel Rivals, but that's part of why I hate hero shooters, because they are so dependent on your team that if your team's bad, you just can't do anything. And I know I mentioned earlier that the only thing that really makes me mad in games is wasting my time, but a very close second would be taking away my agency, because if I don't have any agency in the game I'm playing, why am I playing the game? But that's it for that. Hopefully Marvel Rivals does get a role queue, or at least something similar to it, so I can fucking play the characters that I want without having to capitulate to other people's requests. But for now, it's just the way that it is. And if anything, I guess I can't complain that I'm going to be getting a long break from Marvel Rivals, because maybe when I come back, it'll be good again. But I'd say again, like I've been playing the game for years. It's been out for a week at this point. I hope it'll be better, is the point. Buff Captain America so that he's better to play. Add more healers and more tanks. Like, genuinely, why are there so many fucking DPS characters and so few of the others? And it'll be a better game, but we'll see. And as for this series, I'm going to be taking a break from it because I won't be able to record it for about a month. So you're going to get, like, 4 episodes that I pre-recorded and then 1 week off. And hopefully the things that I have to talk about won't pile up that much while I'm away, so that the Backlog Bunker that I record when I come back will be like an hour long. But no guarantees. Though I will be spending the majority of it just playing Yakuza 7, so hopefully it'll only be about that. But again, we'll see. But thanks for watching, happy holidays, and I'll see you guys when I see you. Get out of here.